Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good afternoon. Welcome everyone. My name is John Leslie. I am the Chief Communications Officer here at the University of Colorado Boulder, and it's my privilege to serve as your moderator for today's session. Today is Thursday, April 11th, 2024. It is 1:46 p.m., and this is panel number 18001, entitled In the Hot Seat: How Climate Change Affects Planetary Security. I'm going to begin by reading the CU Boulder Land Acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, faculty, and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you. I'm going to introduce our panelists in a moment, and we'll get into the discussion. But first, wanted to let you know we will reserve time at the end for Q&A. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. If you would like to pose a question, simply raise your hand at any time, and one of our producers will bring you a note card. Please write legibly, and if you're a student, please note this in your question on the card. When you finish writing your question, raise your hand to hand the card back to the producer, who will bring it up to me when we're ready to start the Q&A. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point, and I'll try to do the same. I probably won't be able to ask all the questions we get submitted, and I may combine similar questions. So with that, I'd like to start with introducing our panelists. It's my privilege to introduce you to Alexander Verbeek, who is a Dutch environmentalist, editor of the Planet newsletter, public speaker, and podcaster. Alexander is also a former diplomat and former strategic policy advisor at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and has worked on international security, humanitarian and geopolitical risk issues, and the linkage to the Earth's accelerating environmental crisis. He has much to say on the topic of planetary security. He's also a long-standing CWA speaker, and we're very excited to see you again. Thanks for being back.
Thank you.
Rachel Sigman is an assistant professor of democratic governance at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, just down the road, and a project manager with the Varieties of Democracy Institute based at the University of Gothenburg.
Good enough.
Thank you, in Sweden. Her book, Parties, Political Finance, and Governance in Africa, explains how political money shapes government performance in Africa. And Rachel's other work examines a range of topics related to democratic backsliding, state building, the effects of natural resource extraction on governance, and U.S. influence in Africa. Thank you for being here for your second panel at CWA.
Thank you.
And I'd also like to introduce you to Amber Case, who's a research fellow at the Meta Governance Project and founder of the Calm Technology Institute, which made me feel good the second I read about it. Amber is also an internationally recognized design advocate and the author of 4 books, including Calm Technology and a kid's book about technology. Amber has been named one of Inc. magazine's 30 Under 30 and Fast Company's most influential women in technology. And she has also been named a National Geographic Emerging Explorer and received the Claude Shannon Innovation Award from Bell Labs. Please welcome our panelists today. So I'd like to start by giving each of our panelists 3 or 4 minutes to talk about the question I had when I learned about this panel, which is, what is planetary security? And can you share some thoughts on it and maybe an example or 2 from your perspective or your disciplinary area? And we'll start with Alexander.
Thank you. It's interesting that the 3 speakers here, together we wrote 5 books and I wrote none of them. So that's, maybe I should write about it. And maybe I should someday write about planetary security because I've been highly involved in it from the beginning. Actually, it's my word, I kind of coined it, but I never wrote a book about it. So I should, because if you Google planetary security, you see thousands of hits and everybody talks about it. So what is it and where does it start? If we go back a little bit in history, in about, I think it was 2007, that Al Gore produced the movie An Inconvenient Truth, which is one of the best titles of a movie ever, because it's true and it's pretty inconvenient, climate change. Climate change was not new. Scientists were working on it, were warning for it. People that were involved knew already about it, but he introduced it to the broader public. And it was also picked up in security cycles. So just 1 or 2 years later, in think tanks in Washington, this was picked up and they started to talk about climate security. How will this changing climate impact our security? Will we get climate wars or water wars? Those kind of things. That's the kind of words that the journalist made out of it. Some people at different places in the world were working on it, in Germany and in the early days, especially in the UK and in Washington. But when I got involved, and I have a many years of background in security, but I'm also a geographer and I've worked a lot on the environment. And in the first half of my working life, that when I worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and at different postings as a diplomat, those were like 2 opposite ends of the spectrum. If you worked in the security department, what I sometimes did, you would never ever set a foot in the environmental department, and the other way around. They were literally physically on the other sides of the ministry. But climate change will impact our security, and when we started to use that concept, I got involved and I realized that 2 things were missing. One is that climate is too limited because there's all kinds of other environmental changes that we're dealing with. You can also look at biodiversity loss, pollution, water problems, etc. You can have a water problem that is not related to climate change, but is still impacting security. And the other aspect was that security was originally very much defined as interstate security. One country takes so much water off a river that the downstream country doesn't get enough water, and that's in a time of climate change where it's getting warmer and you need more water. Then you can have conflict, and then Egypt threatens to bomb a dam, the Gerd Dam in Ethiopia, that kind of conflict. But it lacked the concept of human security on the individuals, on the families that are going to suffer from climate change. And as an individual, and you live in some kind of poor country in Africa, and you and your family are dying because of drought doesn't matter much if you're dying because of a war. The end result is pretty bad and is very much the same. So the human security and the international security is much more a continuum, which was already a longer debate. So planetary security is about all these kind of our hitting the planetary boundaries and the security impacts on international security as well as individual security. Now, the second thing that was missing, apart from this broader concept, was that although in think tanks people were working on this issue, they never met. There wasn't like an international conference on this issue. They were reading each other's stuff. So while I worked on this in 2014, when I was for half a year at Yale University, I came back for one more year to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, my last year there. And in that year, I created this planetary security concept, or in diplomatic speak, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands created this, and I helped him once I had convinced him that we should do that. And then at the end of that year, we created the first international conference on planetary security in the Peace Palace in The Hague, and that started a whole series. So that's a bit on the background. I have moved on to other interesting fields to write and talk about, so I never expected that so many years later I would talk in a conference again on planetary security after I did that for many years. I very briefly, so what are we talking about? Is climate really causing wars? Well, no, but can you think of any other issue, can you think of any war in the past that has one single trigger, say whatever, First World War? Was that the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, or was that the Triple Entente, or was that whatever else? It's a mix of all kinds of reasons. But climate change makes the whole thing more difficult. So the word that's often used is a threat multiplier or a catalyzer of conflict. So that is the kind of context we're talking about. There's some, but I've spoken for years on this, so I think I overstayed my invitation already to speak for a few minutes. So I'll stop here.
All right, thank you. I'm going to start by saying I have no idea what planetary security is. So I'm going to take Alexander's word for it, that it's, I think, something that brings together climate change, environment, interstate conflict, and human security. And so from my perspective, I spend a lot of time thinking about how governments, specifically governments in Africa and across the global south, respond to very difficult challenges that they have to respond to. And climate change and planetary security, more generally, is what we might call a wicked problem, in which when you try to address one part of it, you might cause problems somewhere else. And so, I think one thing that can be helpful is thinking specifically about the governance dimensions that either exacerbate these problems or that help to mitigate them. And so from the perspective of, say, African countries or other countries throughout the world that don't exercise very much power in our international system, I think there's a specific set of challenges that we, as in we in the US, often forget about when we're thinking about how to tackle this wicked problem internationally. And so I wanted to take just a couple minutes and sort of highlight some of the things that, some of the issues that come up from the perspective maybe of the global south that we don't hear as much about here. And so the first thing I'll say is that when it comes to addressing climate change and human security and development, that we have sort of a chicken and egg problem. And that is that it requires more economic development in order for countries to be able to for example, transition to green energies, or to address climate change to adapt to climate change or to mitigate the impacts of it. And so I was just reading a blog post from a colleague of mine who works at Georgetown. His name is Ken Opalo. He was calling attention to something happening in South Sudan right now, where because the school, basically it's too hot for children to go to school. And so, of course, there's no air conditioning. These classrooms are all basically almost outdoors. And so, if education is a key to addressing climate change, right? We need a populace who's educated, and yet it's too hot for people to go to school. How do we even begin to address this problem? And so there needs to be, so we need to think about how to at once tackle development challenges while also tackling climate change. The second thing is, what we might put into the realm of climate justice, and that is that countries such as those in Africa emit an extremely small proportion of greenhouse gases, and yet they feel the impacts just as much, if not more, than other countries around the world, and especially of the historical polluters. So this creates sort of a political problem, right? It's difficult to garner motivation, incentives for governments to tackle these issues that they're not necessarily responsible for. And then the third thing I'd just bring attention to is thinking about the critical minerals that are essential for a green energy transition. Cobalt, rare earth elements, copper, so on. A lot of these are found in Africa or other places throughout the global south. And what we know is that when there's sort of global competitive dynamics for resources, right, that this often has somewhat challenging governance implications for the countries that produce these minerals. And so this is most well known with oil and what we might call the resource curse or the oil curse. But it also raises a particular problem for countries, for example, in Africa, that are home to these minerals and where there may be a very rapid increase in demand that then generates, for example, inequalities in who reaps the benefits from these kinds of profits, how these minerals are extracted, whether or not they're extracted in environmentally sound ways or not. So I just wanted to, I guess, without being too gloomy here, sort of highlight some of the challenges that are the governance challenges that are particularly thorny, I think, for countries, countries in Africa and across the global south. And just note the sort of need, perhaps, as we think about, I don't know if we'll talk about responses and policies and so forth, but kind of think about more graduated approaches or disaggregated approaches that don't, that go beyond just calling for a percentage reduction across all countries, but really keep in mind the specific contexts in which these governance decisions need to be made, and make sure to have sort of context-specific solutions that work for all countries across the world. Thanks.
Amber?
Hello, everyone. I am excited to be on this panel. However, my expertise is not in this area. I just am extremely personally interested in this area. However, I have some adjacencies that might be worthy of discussion. So when I was 12, I went to this kind of Saturday science program course run by ESRI, the Environmental Systems Research Institute. And they taught us how to use geographic information systems tools. So you could go have a map, you could overlay certain map information on it, and you could do a kind of computational geography. So you could start to do these really interesting things like where's the average temperature going to rise, where is humidity going to rise, where are the freshwater areas. You could put all these data sets together, and then you could say, give me the 10 cities that will be least affected by climate change. This was extraordinary to be given what I considered at 12 fourth dimensional superpowers, where you could take a 50-year floodplain, or you could take all these different things. And then at the end they told us, this is a huge industry, and this is what many governments use and many corporations use. Let's say you're planning a Starbucks coffee shop, and you want to make sure it's not in this floodplain. You want this population amount, you want a demographic layer, and you overlay, and then you solve. Very expensive to do. Often you get trained in this. You might get a 4-year degree in geography, and I'm sure you've used these tools. And so I was really fascinated by that, and I said, I want to go into this field of study. A couple years later, forgot the name of the software, was trying to ask people. Generally, people who are not part of government had no idea what I was talking about. So I went into tech, and I ended up making one of the very first location-based startups, pre-built it before the iPhone had a GPS chip, and then deployed it on the iPhone when I got the chip, and a couple of years later, we were selling the company, and who came to be interested in purchasing us but the founders of Esri. So I ended up learning, hey, it's this company that I got introduced to when I was 12. And so I got to meet one of my favorite names ever, Jack Dangermond. Incredibly interesting last name, but he had grown up around a plant nursery. And so he said something that was very interesting when we were talking about, how do you run this new division of this company? I was running an R&D center in Portland, Oregon. We were making new tools and trying to really just make it easier to do things within the company. And he said, problems are like aphids. They're born pregnant. And I was bringing a lot of plants into the office and was dealing with an aphid infestation at the time. And I thought about it like that a lot when, I think that humans obviously we're very good at thinking like, well, if you're doing a weight loss plan, you just do every day, and really it's like nothing happens, oh, and then everything happens and you feel great, or like watching a plant grow, nothing happens. All of the stuff is happening behind the scenes, below the surface of the soil, and then suddenly, oh, well, it's stable enough now. The green's up. This is good, and that kind of this type of curve growth, I really don't think people are used to. And the problem is that when we're dealing with climate change, you have nothing happens, oh no, everything happens. And I was really interested in just looking at very specific things like climate change being a kind of hyperobject. I don't know if you've heard this term before. A hyperobject is something so complex that it's just really hard to get into your mind because there's so many things, and now people get so overwhelmed you have to go to therapy about climate fears because there's this idea that you don't quite understand of this looming something or nothingness. You want to be able to do something. So I ran a very small web-based conference called The Future of Water, where I said, let's just take one small thing that touches everything and get a bunch of different people's perspectives, from the Maldives and indigenous perspectives and aquifer protection perspectives, technology perspectives, and just get a bunch of information and say, one of the people there had this amazing talk where he talked about it didn't take a lot of high tech to make a weather forecasting system. So why don't we have a water forecasting system so that we can tell, talking about computational geography, so you can tell a little bit in the future when there's going to be a terrible thing that's going to happen and use the technology for what it's good at, understanding this curve base instead of this thing that we think is how things go. And I really like that perspective. So from my perspective, I'm just really interested in how to model things out, kind of see a potential future, and then use all of the tools that we can, from diplomacy and what I like to call like gradient softening. It's like, oh, this area is going to get very difficult, so let's pre-plant a lot of mangroves here because we've identified this area, and then that becomes that kind of boundary softener that prevents this kind of weather situation. So I'm really interested in what can you do if you have the information, and then of course information is political, but that's kind of where my interest lies and why I'm so interested in this area. So it's a real honor to be here with both of you. I appreciate what you've both done, and thank you so much.
Thank you all. So any reactions to each other's comments before I dive into questions? I think we had a really interesting kind of grounding of planetary security from Alexander. We talked about some of the challenges, and particularly from a governance lens, and then fascinating exploration from Amber of how solutions could potentially be developed. But I'm curious if you had any thoughts for each other before I dive into a question.
Yeah, one or two. First of all, on on what Rachel was saying about those poor countries that are so affected by climate change, and that is, we live in an extremely unequal world. We're here present in the country that has historically emitted more greenhouse gases than any other country in the world, and you're now a good number second after China. So you have, I would say, a historic responsibility, including my own country, Netherlands, because we've been burning quite a bit too, although not at your rate. We didn't able to match that far. So there is a historic kind of connection. If you then look at the impact of climate change on security, and you mix all of these things, you see that, as Rachel was saying, it's just these vulnerable countries. Take whatever, a country like Somalia or something that has contributed absolutely nothing to the problem, is getting now more affected faster than all kinds of other countries, and on top of that is the least capable of taking care of the problem. They're the least resilient, so to say. So that's just to kind of echo what you were just saying, at the risk of being mansplaining here. But I just very much agree with what you were saying. And on Amber, the curve that she described, the famous climate scientist Michael Mann, I think he became famous by coining that as the hockey stick. For a long time, a hockey stick is laying like this, and then it goes up. If we put that image of climate change rising so fast if you look at the stability of the international world at the moment, that is also like that. For a long time, certainly after the end of the Cold War, it was pretty stable, but now it's rapidly getting far more unstable, and actually your country might accelerate that instability by voting for the wrong guy in November, and then we really get a very unstable world. So I'm very worried about two things. On last thing on this climate change rising so much. I've worked on climate change since forever, 20 years or so, I don't know. It's only in the past 5 years or so that I daily experience it myself, that I go from heat wave to heat wave, and that I bought now an air conditioning for my house in the Netherlands. I grew up in a country where nobody has air conditioning, but I just had some nights that I really couldn't sleep anymore. So daily I experience that, and to end with just one example of how bad things are at the moment. 2 days ago, the city of Biarritz, that is on the west side of France, close to Spain, made a temperature record, not a temperature high, but the highest minimum record. So in 24 hours, it didn't get colder than 22.5 degrees centigrade, which is somewhere in the 70s or so, I guess, in Fahrenheit. But never, ever in the month of April had the city of Biarritz measured 22.5 degrees. You would expect you break a heat record at the end of April, right? When you're closer to the summer. But it gets worse. It was not only for Biarritz, it was in all of France, including Corsica in the middle of the Mediterranean, where they had never measured this temperature. But it gets worse. If you look at all of France, in the whole month of May, they had never ever measured this temperature. And it gets worse. Never in the month of June has they ever measured this temperature we measured this year in early April. We have to go all the way to July to find such a hot night temperature at like 3 o'clock in the morning that is still 22.5 degrees. It's just an example of the kind of weather extremes we are dealing with now. It is now going so rapidly, of course aided by the El Nino event that is a natural thing that sometimes comes back, but it's against the background and the more structural change of climate change. And it will impact our lives in many, many aspects, not only in the poorer countries, which is because they're so much more vulnerable and you see it so much earlier, they're more easily impacted. Also for us, think for instance, from a security perspective, that now that the Arctic is rapidly melting, there is suddenly an ocean between Russia and the United States, and between Russia and Canada. There's a completely new ocean developing right now that you need to defend. Russia has about 50 icebreakers, and the US has only one from the 1960s. That's difficult fighting a war there. US not prepared for something like that. Or staying in the West and staying with the US. Your main harbors, like the biggest Navy harbor in the East, Norfolk, I guess, that is rapidly dealing with extremely rapid sea level rise. The east coast of the US, the sea is rising faster than at other places in the world. It's not like a bathtub. If you fill your bathtub at home, that on the left and the right it goes equally. It works differently in the real world on a planetary scale. They are now raising the level of all the, I don't know all those Navy words in English, even though I'm a naval officer, but they're raising all the facilities in the harbor. But even though, and that costs billions, but even when that is ready, you still need to get your naval officers and your troops from the land to the ships. But there's about 40 kilometers or 40 miles in between to get there, and all those roads and infrastructure, which is not Navy property, is also going underwater. So that is a security risk where there's no enemy involved, but it does hamper your security. Or think about planes that can no longer get up because the tarmac is melting. So it's these kind of problems that we're thinking about.
Yeah, that makes me think about a question. Rachel, I'm very curious from your perspective. You talked about the pressures on military security, but also the kind of existing dynamics between rivals. So, Russia versus Canada, US, et cetera. I see some pressures on things like the UN as a global governance structure. I'm curious how, Rachel, from your work, you see additional pressures kind of surfacing that are legacy pressures, but also how new dynamics are impacting and maybe driving the need for a reevaluation of how international governance works.
Yeah, thanks. Definitely, I think I think stepping back a little bit, when we think about climate governance, we can think about it at different levels and with different actors, right? And there's no one level or institution or actor that's going to solve this problem. It's got to be attacked on all realms, right? So at the international level, certainly the UN and the COPs and all the treaties and so forth have been the main sort of policy arena through which the international approaches play out. And these have been primarily focused on mitigation, right? So we can think about mitigation versus adaptation. And what Alexander was just talking about, I think, was a lot of adaptation, right? Like things that we need to do in order to ensure that the impacts of climate change are not as severe as they might be otherwise. A lot of the international effort has been focused on mitigation, how we get countries to reduce their greenhouse gases or transition to green energies, or not start emitting greenhouse gases in the first place. But sort of speaking to my prior point, and I think this speaks to the issues, the informational issues as well that Amber was talking about. A lot of countries, what they're dealing with immediately is adaptation, right? Like they're not in a position to have a long-term green energy strategy or anything like that. They're dealing with people dying or violence breaking out because resources are scarce and so forth. So I guess I would just say, if I had to advise the UN to do one thing, right, it would be to ensure that mitigation and adaptation are considered together equally, or in a different proportion than they're currently being addressed. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And then I don't know if anyone has a thought on global accountability for commitments, because it feels like planetary security without a mechanism for accountability. There's talk of loss and damage, and I think there was some breakthrough at COP28 on that topic, but what are your thoughts on what accountability measures are necessary in order for real progress either on adaptation or mitigation to take place? Anyone with thoughts on that?
Yeah, the whole loss and damage debate is a long one and a painful one. I'm glad we got some kind of breakthrough, but we've had breakthroughs in the past as well. Basically meaning that the countries that created the problem are going to help the countries suffering from the problem to help with it. We've several times promised and then reconfirmed that we would send huge amounts of money to a fund to help, but we haven't done so. And at last COP28, we got a little step further, and we kind of recognize the whole principle now, which I guess is fair enough. It used to be very toxic in the West to talk about it. Will that really solve it? Well, the impact of climate change is developing now so rapidly that you every year need far more money. So of course everything you do is welcome. As the last thing, I very much agree with what Rachel was just saying. You have to, if you have a problem, let's say if you have a flooding in the house, you need to do two things. You have to stop the water tap that creates the problem that is leaking, but you also have to take care of the furniture and everything that's drowning. It's a bit the same with climate change. You cannot do just one or just the other. You have to tackle both.
Yeah. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit more about information. Amber, you kind of opened this up relative to tools at our disposal to utilize information for the purposes of predicting and then solutioning, which I love. But there's also the question of the quality of information that the publics around the world are receiving and the kind of sources and motivations behind that. I'm curious for your thoughts on kind of the ways in which information can be used for the purposes you outlined, and also any admonitions relative to how misinformation has been utilized maybe to hold progress up.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about just the disinformation, misinformation front, where if it's expensive for you to conflict with another country, you can create very successful disinformation campaigns, as we've seen, and they can sway elections, and they can work with the incentive models of social networks like Facebook to increase the amount of ads that people click on, and I think there's a huge security hole there. Also, just thinking about all of the rare minerals that we need in order to transition to clean energy, which is still using very,
Uses a lot of energy.
It uses a lot of energy. Like for instance, like windmill turbine blades, like they might need to be taken apart every 2 years, and then you have to chop up the blades, and then people are burning them for fuel. It's not super green, but just looking at the disinformation campaigns that are happening now, you have foreign countries that are funding journalism schools in Africa, and then, and I think like 1 in 5 are foreign funded at this point, to actively be not so excited about exporting minerals to the West. And it's just kind of a very long, slow strategy of, it's a lot more like just playing like a game of nature than it is about playing chess. It's just try to capture the intellectual territory and to kind of hit people's amygdalas so that they feel that the world is this way versus this way, and turn people against each other. And I think that being able to be very precise about where those disinformation sources are coming from, where the funding is coming from, and then knowing how to counter them. It's not like you can fight disinformation with disinformation, because then you erode trust. But allowing people to see the disinformation, like when you go onto Twitter or Fox News, and being able to have antibodies against it, so that if you experience it, you just get tougher. And I think that kind of education on all fronts, and learning from countries that have been very successful very successfully guarding their populations against disinformation and foreign funding towards disinformation strategies are a really good place to learn from. This summer I was looking at all sorts of different countries that had successfully, or more or less, gotten their populations to be a little bit more resilient towards it. And I think right now, thankfully, we can just say disinformation, versus like in 2013, I would be up at 3 a.m. watching bots run by other country accounts that were obviously wrong, and trying to tell my friends, there's these things that show up at 3 a.m, and then somebody else retweets them, and then by the time people are awake, this is considered the real thing, because it just skips any of your frontal cortex, and it just goes right to your amygdala and just makes you feel something. And I think I'm really interested in how do you map incentive models so that either you can understand what the incentives are for this disinformation and have it be less annoying to deal with, and less likely to fall into it, and two, understanding the incentive models for different industries. For instance, fast fashion is one of the biggest water users in the world. I was trying to make an article about this called the $500,000 leather jacket. If you were to actually calculate what it costs environmentally to produce a single H&M leather jacket that sells for maybe $109, what would it actually cost environmentally when you think about the leather tanning process? It's not just about raising the cattle, it's about how you produce that material and how that goes into the water supply, and how the people there have to go through chemotherapy, and how much does that cost, and how much does the drug company make off of this whole thing. I think one of the things that we can do is just broaden our horizons on when you have the real information around it, what can you do? And I think that the problem is that generally that information is very expensive. And then if you try to do armchair environmentalism, which is hard not to do, where you're looking on LinkedIn or Twitter and someone's saying this horrible thing, actually being able to know how to investigate, to get the real data, and then to make new connections around, hey, if much of the, and this isn't totally verified, but if most of the plastic in the ocean comes from a couple of rivers, maybe like 12 rivers, how can you work with the governments of the countries that have those rivers to make some sort of amazing model of pre-ocean plastic and sell that to Nike and Adidas and all these companies, so that suddenly the thing that was considered trash is considered a fantastic natural resource that has suddenly shown up in their country, that everyone is competing to harvest before it goes into the ocean, so that things change. And I think with good information, the ability to get at those information sources, to synthesize them, and to say, how do we swap those models, we can start to get a little bit further up the chain on starting to disintermediate some of these things. It's just that the disinformation is in the way so often that it's hard to actually get a full long-term thought into your head, or work on something for the 10 to 20 years that it takes to have nothing happen in the beginning and then everything happen at the end. And I think that patience, that attention span, is not something that we're used to having, because we just click online and everything's there for us. And so that muscle has to be redeveloped. And I don't know what the incentive models are to redevelop that muscle, but I think that's the opposite of what we're experiencing right now with our attention.
Thank you for that. Reactions?
Sure. I guess my sense of the information environment surrounding climate change is that, first of all, we do have a lot of good, high-quality information. We have the IPCC and many scientists all over the world who have produced a tremendous amount of knowledge about this problem. I think in some ways it's a problem of having too much information, and the information being too technical and too complex to mobilize response, right?
Yep.
Of course, I don't mean to say there's not disinformation or politicization. Of course, there's all of that. But for example, if you look at, young people in the United States who identify more on the right side of the spectrum, a lot of them are very concerned about climate change, even though their party leaders are not, right? And are trying to manufacture misinformation or disinformation about this. So I think, in some ways, I think a big part of the problem is how do we take the wealth of information we have and translate it into, bite-sized pieces that people can digest and respond to. And I think, I would say actually there's been some progress on that front. Like, we have better models now. What does the world look like if there's a 1 degree increase or a 2 degree increase or a 3 degree increase? And so I guess I'm a little hopeful in that regard. I think we're getting better at sort of communicating that and dealing with that. What I think is challenging is when, and this is what I love about what Amber was saying about the kind of taking one issue, right? How do we, as a local community, or as a community that's concerned about an issue like water specifically, how do we kind of extract the information we need and respond to it? And so I guess I'd like to, just pose that question or think about like, can we point to examples where groups have done that successfully? Yeah.
Thank you for that. Alexander, anything from you?
We are in this climate crisis because governments have been very sloppy in taking action and in coordinating and doing it. The governments have not done what we ask as citizens of our governments to take care of our future and the future of our kids. Planet is destroyed now. Soon it is. Why is that? That's because of information. The management of misinformation funded by the oil and gas companies. I think this is a massive criminal plot by those that knew better than anybody else in the world how damaging their activities were by not warning the governments and the public for climate change, even though the best climate experts in the world were employed by them, but actually doing the opposite of saying that there was no problem by actively funding campaigns to create confusion. All of you have heard many years in your life items on television or in other media about climate change where the reporter added, there's still no consensus between the scientists. You've heard it over and over again for decades after all the scientists fully agreed on what was going on, except for a few fake failure scientists that were hired to create all kinds of misinformation, which was absolutely clear for anybody, any journalist who did a little bit of research. You knew exactly what was going on. We don't talk about 20th century information. We talk about 19th century knowledge. Climate change is an extremely easy concept for anybody that is a first or second year student at university understands it. We understand now what people understand already 150 years ago. So the issue of information is essential. What we still don't get, I think most people nowadays that are the kind of people that attend these conferences, they know that climate change is true. They know that the scientists what they are producing, they know. I don't think that the people that I normally talk to realize how quickly and how destructive climate change will be, how it will really impact our lives. Because if we would really understand, it would be the #1 priority in any election anywhere in the world. But it's not. You're talking about, what are the issues here? Abortion? We stopped discussing that in the 1980s when we solved that and found consensus. What are you talking about? Guns? No, you're not talking about guns. You should. But we discuss the wrong issues. The real issue, the most existential issue for the future of the whole planet where we can live is climate change. It's going to have in the next decades already devastating consequences. It already has, but it's going to impact our lives, going to impact everybody's lives. But if you think about our children, my daughter's 21. She has, is better medical advantages and living much healthier than we did when we were young. She's going to live until she's 100. She's got another 80 years. It's hard to sleep at night with the knowledge I have, which is publicly available everywhere, of what's going to happen on the kind of, the second half of her life, and she might get children. And that is probably true for all of you. This should be the number one issue. So when you have elections coming up, if there's just one thing that you should be concerned about, apart from the future of democracy, then vote for the guy that takes action, or the woman, but in your case it's a guy. So, well, that's my 5 cents.
All right, thank you. I'll go ahead and take the questions we have if you want to bring those up, Luca. Thank you. And while you're coming up, really appreciating the discussion with all of you. I have an 11-year-old who really cares about climate change, and I can't get him to turn off a light. So I think there's an AI solution there where maybe we just take that out of his discretion. So I'm curious about the concept of consumption and technology and kind of the commercial nature of the global north for sure, but the globe itself, like how economics works. How does that influence planetary security dynamics and what needs to be done, and what do we need to think about differently if we're going to change that model? And I'll let anyone who wants to chime in.
I have a lot to say. You go first.
Sure. I think a lot about human scale technology and human scale governance, which is, especially in the United States history, even like 30, 40 years ago, you could start your own small group. Let's say you're a model train enthusiast or a chrysanthemum club enthusiast, and you would be able to have a self-similar governance structure, kind of a fractal governance structure that had constitutions. You would probably understand Robert's Rules of Order, an incredibly good technology for making sure that people don't take up all of the airspace at a public forum. Really good for boards. And you'd be able to start one at the small local level, and you could have your state, your regional chapters, and your kind of like larger chapters, and have a cadence of meetings and understand how to deal with conflict. You also would have what I don't think a lot of us have anymore for some reason is slack in your life to be able to have a big time hobby where you might go home and be able to build a car in your garage, or be a woodworker, or have a machine shop, or be able to do some sort of creative thing like knitting, and be able to produce something interesting for your family. So I just meet a lot of people who their grandparents made a lot of stuff for them. And of course these things are, sometimes they're not treasured objects, but a lot of times they are, of these things that were made and passed down from the family. And then you have a bunch of people who very, very, very much want to be able to do this. But like life right now and the way that inflation works and everything doesn't afford these abilities to go deeply into something, or to have that practice, unless maybe you're in student government, of dealing with these small scale complexities, or even having the time to go to a local council meeting and help work with the governance of your small town. You might get an app that makes people fight with each other online, like Nextdoor, where people just get angry at each other. And everyone's part of Nextdoor, and that's not the equivalent of like local governance. So some of the things that I've been doing is just going towards what's being called exstitutional instead of institutional. What can you do outside of institutions? I've been hanging out with a lot of, we just call it experimental governance scholars. We were at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet Society at Harvard Law School for a while. And I just got back from rural France, where we were running some of these governance projects, where it's like, can we make a self-regulating, metastable system in which we get into cadence and can maintain with each other and solve problems. Now, of course, people have been trying to do this for a really long time, but the thing is, I think people will have to do this because I don't think there's going to be a bunch of, like, the amount of chaos. Like, I don't think there's people waiting for, and then the government will come and rescue me, or some person with a helicopter will come in, and, like, there's just going to be too many emergencies. So I think it's the other thing is just the consumption part of people are so excited. There's no fashion seasons anymore. You just click on whatever you see online and you get really excited. And if you're depressed and you go into your phone and you click an ad, you get a box delivered to your house. You don't even get to have this deep relationship with your technology or your objects because it's a shifting sand and changes so much that you don't have an item that's really, really well made that you can have for 100 years. Or even, like, imagine using the same app for more than 2 years, or even the same phone. Why do we need to keep buying a new phone? Like, wasn't it already good enough? We survived with it in 2008. Like, why do we need another one? And so it's a very strange thing that, like, constantly we need to buy the new thing and then get reassociated with it. We can never really settle and, like, come home. So I think those incentive models to me are very, very dangerous, compared to, like, turning off the light in the house. An AI company would sell you on the idea, we're going to auto turn off and on your lights. And then you have, the I have no mouth but I must scream governance situation in which this, like, supposedly benevolent, weird creature managed by a software team is deciding when you should have your lights on and off in your house.
Yep.
Versus you being able to just turn off and on the light, and that's just such a smokescreen away from how much energy giant companies run building condos and other new stuff versus making really long-term things. So I think it's that, publicly traded companies that have to make quarterly profits, people clicking on stuff and buying stuff because the stuff that they have is falling apart and isn't speaking to them, and not being able to make or mend or do any of these things. Like, I would like to see a future, and we might get forced into it, where we have to learn all of that stuff because we have to take care of ourselves a little bit more. So I think those things are distracting us from really living, and it's kind of like a fragmented experience right now, I think, for a lot of us.
Thank you, Amber. Great comment. All right, I'm going to switch to our questions, and this question came in from a student. The international system is historically based on competition. Do you think we need to shift to a cooperation-based model to tackle the climate crisis? And if so, how do we switch? Thank you for your answers in advance.
There you go.
Well, yes, solving climate change asks for cooperation. It's not that countries in the past were only in competition and that now we should move into a phase of cooperation. There has been an enormous amount of cooperation between countries in the past. Let's say an issue like human rights, for instance. You can only establish a worldwide agreement on what rights of humans are so fundamental that we all accept them as human rights. That is a cooperation effort. You don't get there in a kind of competition. So there's always been a mix of competition, cooperation. Even if you bring it back to trade, you need international cooperation on getting agreement on how you do the trade, whereas the trade itself is, of course, in a marketplace, is in competition. But the general thought in a world that is getting more and more interconnected in positive ways, but also in its problems, where the problem caused in one country is creating difficulties in another country, and where solutions found on one place only work if you also imply them somewhere else, asks for much more cooperation. And we need a lot more international cooperation in a time where the pendulum of international relations is actually swinging rapidly in the wrong direction. And it is I've been following international politics for the past 40 years or so on a daily basis. And some 25 years of that was professionally as a diplomat, but still the kind of things I do now are very much related to it. Never in those 40 years I've seen a situation which is so frightening and so volatile as it is now. So we need wise and stable leaders in all of our countries with a long-term vision. So I hope you... I'm not going to give any voting advice here.
I think we already know where you're
going.
going.
But you're a big player in the world. So collectively, you have a responsibility. I mean, speaking as a European, as last thought, we have for many centuries done nothing else than killing each other professionally with all kinds of armies, especially the first half of the 20th century when 2 world wars were fought in Europe. Then we've shown to the world a model of cooperation with all its flaws, but that altogether works and has given us some 70, 75 years of freedom and cooperation and welfare and happy lives led by the people who are living there. So cooperation between countries is possible, and it works, and it's highly needed.
Thank you for that answer. Rachel, I think this one might be for you. This is also from a student.
Okay, great.
Do you think coastal cities in the global south will be disproportionately affected by rising sea level, and what will the implications be?
Yes, I do. I think also you can't look at the situation of coastal cities without looking at the impacts on rural areas as well that are driving more and more people to those coastal cities. So we're talking about major patterns of migration and urbanization that then, you know, I'm not a sea level rise expert, and so if either of you have scientific knowledge about that you want to weigh in on, I would welcome that. But I think to the extent that, you know, we anticipate sea level rise to be an issue, coupled with extreme weather events and weak infrastructure systems and water, you know, potable water issues and so forth, certainly the concentration of more and more people in these areas is going to be extremely challenging, and potentially very devastating. Yes.
Thank you for that answer. Next question. Do you see efficacy in lumping climate adaptation mitigation costs into defense budgets as a way to sidestep certain political barriers? That's a really good question and idea, but thoughts? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I find this a really interesting issue and something we talk a lot about at the Corbell School. And but this issue of like securitization, right? So how, to what extent should every policy issue be a security issue? And what does that mean in terms of who gets empowered to respond to it, right? Should I mean, in the US, we already have a disproportionately, like, very powerful military domestically. They, you know, compared to the State Department, for example, they exercise a lot of power in Washington and chart the direction of our foreign policy in a more militaristic direction. And so I think we have to think very seriously. I mean, I don't reject the idea of planetary security or climate security, but I think we have to think very carefully about the language that we use and what that means in terms of who gets the budgets and the power to respond to it, and what that means for our broader policies. And so I'm very nervous about, like, I used to work for the military, a full disclosure, and there's wonderful people, and I learned a ton, and very smart, very service-oriented people who really deeply care about the world. But I don't think that, at least here in the United States or really anywhere, that the military should be the main or only driver of our policies and our solutions. So.
Thank you for that. Anyone else with thoughts? No? Okay. Kind of a similar vibe to this question, not necessarily military specific, but so COP28 set up a fund to finance countries experiencing climate change. Question is, what do you believe the U.S. share should be on a percentage basis for loss and damage funding?
Ooh. You're looking at me. Isn't there an American that can answer this? Well, I don't know, there's different ways. Of course, the way they'll come to these numbers is a very complicated negotiation process, I'm sure. One way you could look at this is looking at the historical contribution to the problem. If the US contributed, let's say, 25% of all the greenhouse gases ever emitted, then, well, you could argue you pay 25% of the price, right? I mean, that would be, if there's some kind of other problem, you go to an insurance company because whatever, you had a car crash and this one was guilty for 25% and the other for so much, that's probably how you settle. But we don't live in an ideal world, nor do I expect that it's going to be this number. I leave that to the climate experts at the next dozen or so COPs to be negotiated.
If I may, I'm just thinking about how that number gets calculated. If it does get calculated, and let's say the United States says, oh, well, China's the big producer of these gases, but how much of it was from supply chains that, the United States ordered?
Yeah.
And then, do you, as an individual, like if you could get your own climate footprint as an individual, it would probably be pretty scary. I also think that the things that you think might be in there might not be the same things as are actually there. So for instance, I keep saying clothing. Clothing's a big one. When, maybe when you fly on a plane, you think that that's pretty big. But actually it might be, did you buy a new condo or house? Or did, I just keep thinking about, any of these migration movements that are definitely going to happen and are already happening very quietly. All of that's going to require new construction and more expense. And so I feel like, and some of this I can't say because it's like confidential clients, but there are several companies that I worked with that they are doing like very large construction. We were doing 10-year plans with them, but there was a model in which part of their emerging business, and they're a very conservative company whose board members they all understand climate change, but they're like, hey, if we work with it, it's too expensive. So we're trying to make sure that it's not a public issue because it would cost us more money and we can't afford that on our bottom line right now. But part of like 30-40% of their business model going forward becomes environmental remediation, disaster issues, where all of these cities and states will require their services to come in, either for like rebuilding things or setting up barriers against disasters. So it becomes really interesting to see how the models could be changed to where people are competing to make neat impacts on climate, because that part actually becomes profitable.
All right. Well, we are about a minute and a half to time, and I've been told I need to end on time. So I will open it up for a note of optimism that you might want to leave us with. And if not, we understand. But any closing thoughts for the group and for the folks streaming with us today?
As a note of optimism, we can solve climate change. We know how to do it. We have the money, we have the people, we have the technology. The only thing that's missing is political will, and therefore I called upon you to vote for in any election, even at local level and at higher levels, for the right people. On top of that, there are things you can do yourself. Fly less, stop eating meat or eat less meat, and just think about your own environmental behavior, which is as extensive as Amber has just explained, it basically means consuming less is better for the planet. Thank you.
Yeah, just to build on that, I would say, there have been some successes. We have, the knowledge about how to address this issue has improved considerably. I said that earlier, and I'll just repeat it again. And I think, as well as the, progress in the governance arena, which has been very slow and frustrating, but also there has been some. And so I think, just keeping in mind that it is possible to move the bar forward on these things, and that, I would just back up the things that Alexander said in terms of the prescriptions of what to do. So thanks.
Thank you.
I feel like the more people, almost everybody's going to experience some sort of climate issue, no matter what. And I think once you've experienced one, things change. And I think once politicians experience them and understand that, there might be a race to, hey, you'll get elected if you deal with this environmental issue, because it's so costly not to, that it's going to get in the way of you doing politics to not make a stable system. So I'm hoping that will happen, and I'm hoping I never have to experience a fire situation like the one in Portland, Oregon that I experienced, that I had to actually evacuate from. But it's going to happen, and I think we're all here. Humans are weird and flexible, and sometimes when really nasty stuff happens, we work really well then, but not before then. Only when it's a proper emergency. Then everything's different, and all the emergency situations come out, we do everything. So I really hope that it doesn't have to happen this time, but it might. And in that case, I have faith in humanity for doing the really annoying, late to the party thing. But I think something will have to happen. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. That concludes our panel. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of CWA.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.